Hey designers, welcome back to the studio. Today we're going to get a little bit more in depth into some of our shading exercises. Once you have completed a full page, and by full page we'll say for now 3 rows of shading exercises, cross-hatching using the spacing in between lines to create lightness and darkness, stippling using the spaces in between dots, or the dot densities to create values, and then the side of a pencil using kind of a solid tone to create value. We're going to bring those back to one of our drawings. Now, in this previous drawing, I used shading to describe form, and it was helpful in that it starts to make things appear somewhat three-dimensional. But today I want to get more specific as to why that happens or why that works. And I'll give a couple of quick examples. And for now, we'll start with these 2 cylinders because they were the ones I used as an example. And they're the ones I just happen to have set up in the studio. So for doing this in your own studio, it'll be really handy to have your objects set out, and then also maybe a piece of paper. Put a piece of paper behind them. It'll make some of these values a little bit easier to see. So in the previous drawing, I described how in between 2 objects, or when 2 objects approach each other, get close to each other, maybe even touch each other, it usually results in a nice dark shadow. Wherever 2 objects touch, like the cardboard cylinder and the ground here, they'll produce a nice dark shadow, possibly an inside-outside situation, right? The rim on the outside of this cut cardboard tube is very light. The inside space of this cardboard tube is where the kind of rich dark shadows are. But these can be kind of tricky to see, so it's much more easy if you introduce something like an external light source. For me, that means something like this, like a little work lamp. Many of you at your desks have a little work lamp already set up. What that's going to end up doing is producing much stronger, higher contrast values, lights and darks. The ground, or the background, is just going to help throw a little bit simpler background in place. It's also going to maybe help you focus as you draw on them. So a couple things I'll point out. Some of the brightest highlights are not actually on this white background. There's a nice dark shadow on the back side opposite of the light source. Now there's an even stronger inside-outside lighting, and all that changes depending on my lighting angle, right? So now look at how deep and dark the tubes are on the inside versus when my lighting angle was a bit higher. My light sort of already started to throw down into the tube a little bit. What I would like for you guys to do is set up a small lighting setup in your drawing studio and do a lighting study. What this is going to kind of bring into our drawings is sort of a light direction. What I want you to kind of think about here is these 2 cylinders are no longer kind of isolated objects floating in space, but they're responding to a single light source. That single light source is throwing shadows in the same direction on both of them. And that would be the same for any form that we bring in, depending on what you happen to have around in your setup. So right, a 6-sided cube or an extruded rectangle. In general, when you can see the 3 sides of something like a block in this way, one of the sides is light, one of them is sort of a mid-tone, and one of them is a real nice dark shadow, and then a shadow is then thrown on the ground. If I had something like an even more basic cylinder, this gets even easier to kind of think through. One side of the cylinder is light, and because it's rounded, it's not faceted, we have a highlight side of the cylinder, and that rolls around to a shadow side of the cylinder. The way we'll approach drawing some of these will be through the lens of our basic shapes. their basic shapes studies. Keep in mind that when you're grabbing objects, if you happen to grab objects that are really shiny, it would still work, but it throws a little bit more of a complicated lighting space into what we're working on. So some of these flat objects work out pretty well. If you happen to be anywhere near a golf course, go ahead and snag one of those golf balls and slice into one of the sides. I was trying to kind of figure out like what would be a great object to draw that was doing some of those really great inside outsides, kind of the shell looking feel, and I thought a sliced open golf ball would be great. Also possibly if you eat eggs in the morning, save the eggshells. Those would make for really great drawings as well. But especially for these spherical objects. Spheres are rounded in all directions, so like the cylinder, we're not going to have facets, but we'll have a shadow that starts on the dark side, the side opposite our light source, and it'll roll up to a highlight on the top side. Let's do a couple of really basic drawing studies, and then I'll turn you loose in your sketchbooks. So let's start with the basic cylinder, since I already have it set up in my studio here. I could freehand in the cylinder, similar to how we did at the beginning of the semester. Cylinders start with an open top, an ellipse on the top, two straight lines, and an ellipse on the bottom. If I want to true some of those lines up and make them a little bit more, controlled, I could use my templates. And in this case, I'm using a 6H pencil. I'll switch to an HB so it's a bit easier for you guys to see what I'm working on. Okay, so I'm using the cylinder here in my studio, and I'm going to use my graphite pencil here to describe some lighting similar to what I see in this space. What I'm going to be focusing on will be the shadow on the dark side, the highlight on the light side. I'm going to focus on the ground, which would be actually the paper background, and I'm going to focus on a shadow that may fall on the ground. First thing I'll do is I'll take my pencil and work in a ground. In this case, that would be our background. And the background is almost never pure white, and so I'm going to already start by knocking that down. The value that I've laid down on our ground we'll call sort of our basic mid-tone gray, or just our mid-tone. So if I want to break down this drawing into 3 different areas, it'll be my highlight, which will be on the right-hand side here. It'll be my low light, or my shadow, and then my mid-tones. I'm also going to lay in the block that this cylinder is sitting in. That gives me a horizon here in the background. And on the block itself, I've got a shadow that cuts out from behind the block, which follows a diagonal line sort of back from the front, since my light source is coming in at an angle. So I'm going to go ahead and darken the shadow line. Okay, and now I'm also going to pay really close attention to the shadow that plays right at the bottom of my cylinder here, right where it touches. That's a line described along the same ellipse that the bottom of the cylinder was made with. And then I'm going to come up the shadow side of the cylinder and lay in a mid-tone shadow that comes about halfway across the cylinder itself. Then I'll come back in and lay that shadow just a bit darker, but instead of bringing my shading all the way across the cylinder, I'm going to bring it over maybe 1/4 of the cylinder. And then I'll come back one more time right at the edge of the cylinder to make that shadow even darker. So essentially within the dark side of the cylinder, I've laid 3 layers of graphite. One layer that brought me about halfway across, we'll call that a midtone layer. One layer that is sort of, it's approaching the shadow layer, and then right up against the dark side of that cylinder, we'll lay the 3rd layer of shadow in. Now, what should start happening is that my hard contour edges should start to dissolve. Shadows, when you look at them in real life here against the cylinder, are very difficult to see the hard edge of. They don't appear like a nice hard line in the page. So we'll actually have to start drawing our contour lines very, very lightly and always kind of pushing ourselves away from them. In true value studies, we won't maintain a hard contour edge. What we actually will only have will be an interplay of light and dark. So as I kind of make this shadow more and more and more complex, you should see my contour lines start to dissolve. I'll bring just a bit of shadow in from the right hand side here, because the more I focus on this cylinder, the more I see, oh, actually the highlight is on a face of the cylinder, not the edge. And so my edge, because cylinders travel around and they wrap away from me, have shadows on both sides. One is obviously much darker than the other, but I have a shadow on the right and the left side. I'm going to soften the edge of the cylinder shadow. And now I've got my 3 basic tones laid in. If I goof on the edge of a shadow line or something, I could always bring my eraser in and start to kind of lighten things up and blend. But typically, when I'm laying in values, I'm not going to rely on an eraser very much. I'm going to rely on pushing and pulling the values and making my values lighter or darker. And since in this drawing, I started with a white piece of paper, all of the work that I'm going to be doing incrementally makes that page darker. Or in many ways, you can just think of it as making it dirtier. So since I'm just dirtying the page, the only highlights I would bring back in through the use would come in through the use of an eraser. What I would like for you guys to do is do some value experiments according to the lighting that you've got access to in your space. You could change your shapes or you could change your lighting, but I would like you to fill a page with a minimum of 3 drawings.